Great. Let's just take 3 minutes and go over some housekeeping, and then we'll get started with Josh's demo, and then we'll dig into Nikolai's API draft. How does that sound for everybody? And then we can have any walk-on topics. All right, let's see if my screen share will work today. Let's try this out. Can you see like a black screen here?
Yeah.
You guys on the side, you can see it now? Okay, cool. All right, so I posted in the message, but I did put together just a quick spreadsheet organizing some stuff. So this will be the location, sort of source of truth for organizational things. So definitely take a look at it. It should reflect what we've talked about the past couple of weeks. Here's a list of the work streams. The one thing I'd call out is, there are people who have raised their hands to lead several of them, but several of them remain leaderless, or folks who want to drive it forward. So, if that's something that you're interested in, or might know someone who you work with or collaborate with who would be interested in leading some of these work streams that are highlighted here, please let me know. So that's the work stream list. And then I put together just a really brief proposed set of agenda items. Obviously, this is totally up for revision. I just wanted to put something down in the sheet so that we had some idea of what was upcoming. I'll let people know in advance, but this will be the source of truth, what we're looking for in terms of an agenda for each of these weekly meetings. And then, so definitely, folks who are leading some work stream, take a look. I just threw this together. Obviously, it can all change. Any thoughts or suggestions, quick ones on just group organization stuff?
Can you share it with everybody?
Yeah, it's in the announcement summary. There's links in there, but I'll do that every time in Zulu. All right. Okay. So just quick housekeeping. I think we'll probably just do that a couple of minutes at the beginning of every meeting, so we're just stay on the same page. So without that, if there's nothing else, quick items people want to chat about, I think I'll just hand it over to Josh for, let's say, 5 to 10 minute demo.
Yeah, that's more than enough time.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks. So I'll set the stage here a little bit. So Flexiba is a patient consent application in the US market. And basically what we do is make it easy for patients to consent to a medical record retrieval for different purposes, like participation in a clinical trial, for example. And the place we specialize in is connecting to payers. So payer implementations of a Smart on FHIR API. And one of the challenges that we've faced that SQL on FHIR is helping us to address is understanding what we call the fill rate of various resources in the fields inside of them. So the problem, so to speak, is with the 400 different health insurers or payers that have implemented patient access APIs in the US, those implementations differ significantly. You might be familiar with the patient access APIs that are mandated by ONC ASTP. Those are patient access APIs that are provided by the EHR, by the provider. And these are somewhat different in that, well, obviously it's a payer involved, but secondly, as part of that rollout of that mandate, there's been significant differences in implementation in a way that's not true with the EHR APIs. And partly that's because of Inferno being available on the provider side APIs and standardized conformance testing through the ONC certification process. On the payer side, it's like Wild West. And so one of the challenges that we have is understanding how resources are constructed and understanding a variation between hundreds of different FHIR endpoints. So SQL on FHIR is helping us address that. And I'll give you a quick demo here of some of the ways that it is. And I'll maybe highlight some things I saw on the last the recording of the last meeting that I think are going to be valuable to us from an IG publisher perspective and how this could be improved. So let me share my screen and just make sure that I'm sharing the right application. Okay, we should see a terminal here.
Yep.
So what we have done is created a series of view definitions that are specific to our context. So primarily the resources that we are concerned with are patient, explanation of benefit, and coverage, because those are the resources that payers are required to implement at a very bare minimum. And so typical to explanation of benefit, or as a starting point, something as simple as billable periods. This is very useful to us. So to know this helps us understand the period of the coverage, or sorry, for the claim. So that the claim that sort of backs the explanation of benefit. When did this occur? That's a very simple question. Codes are maybe a more complicated example, and this speaks to variance. So in the wild, we are interested in not just ICD-10, but ICD-10-CM, for example. We're sort of interested in knowing whether or not a payer includes one of those code systems. And so we can run this fairly simply. We have some basic command line tools. So the output here is really, we're not trying to transport this data to a data warehouse. We're really just trying to expose this almost to an analyst. So someone who's interacting with this tool in a command line, like a developer, trying to answer some basic questions. So I'll run this command, and we've built some basic tooling here that will list out the view definitions we have, and we can select an example patient ID. The data that's going to be displayed is, of course, just synthetic data. Click node there, and pretty simple, right? Console table, very simple implementation here. Now we have a list of the patient IDs from the 15 resources. Something more complicated, such as that example of the codes. Let's go for EOB and DC codes. So in this case, there's only one resource to report there in the sample data that actually has an NDC code. But this is really helpful to us because, again, in the real world, actually understanding what is available from many, many, many possible originating FHIR endpoints is like a really, really important part of the work that we do. And so when you're thinking about the application or the context in which SQL on FHIR could be used, I think there's maybe a tendency to think exclusively in terms of the domain of your own system. So I'm at a particular institution and we're reviewing our own FHIR resources. But here, this is becoming very powerful for us in terms of evaluation of data at a network layer. And again, in the US context, I could see that in the future being useful for evaluating on TEFCA, for example. So I'll show just a couple other things very quickly. One of the things I was speaking to there, fill rates. So it's not, we don't want to just summarize data that's available, how frequently a particular code system appears. And so we've written some very basic JavaScript, aggregation that takes the results and synthesizes them into a summary. I'm just going to quickly look at the flag I need to add here. Show stats. So if I pass a show stats flag, our little command line tool will do some aggregation for us. So let's pick 12. And so here we have a fill rate percentage automatically returned back to us. Before, this was very complicated for us to actually execute. We have Postgres as a storage backend, and so executing very complicated JSON queries was very, very challenging. And so this, in effect, replaces all of that. We also have a generator tool. So I can run this command and provide some inputs, and very quickly I'll get a very simple view definition resource created. The last thing I'll say is that as far as the implementation guide level goes and the work that's being done on Publisher, we think that's going to be very, very valuable. We participate in a few IGs, in the development of a few IGs, And being able to provide recommended or complementary view definitions as part of the IG from an implementer perspective, I think is very, very, very useful. And we're looking forward to that being available so that in the future, the IG for our particular product is Karen Blue Button, being able to provide ready-made view definitions for interacting with the core profiles available in that IG, I think will be really enabling. But yeah, that's just a quick demo. Hopefully that's helpful for people who are looking for other examples of SQL on FHIR in the wild. We're using this in production. I'm showing it to you with synthetic data, but we are really using this to understand the scope and availability of various resources.
Very cool. Thank you, Josh. We got a couple of questions, or at least one question from Bashir. But yeah, really cool. Great work. It's super interesting, and taking a sort of a little bit of a different dimension, a little bit of a different use case than I think we have thought about before. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing more of this and having you guys be a part of the team. So Bashir.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, cool, for the demo. So I'm not based in US, so I just want to understand the problem statement better first. So if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So this is, the patient gives consent for his data to her data to be used, and then the data is being provided by like an insurance provider, for example, like a payer, based on the claim information that is available to the payer. So that's the problem that you are trying to solve, right?
Yes, that we connect to just over 300 different health insurers and a source of FHIR resources. And yes, it's a smart on FHIR auth.
There is a CMS regulation which force health plans to provide FHIR API for members.
I see. Okay.
API. Yeah.
Right. So I guess then the challenge is that each provider have their FHIR resources in a different way. So they may use a different code system, or they may have use different fields, or basically model their data differently in FHIR. And then you are trying to use the SQL on FHIR to kind of harmonize this presentation.
Right now, we're harmonizing it for the purposes of analysis. So we're harmonizing just to understand the variation between the resource construction, because it would sort of be equivalent to one provider who operates 200 different sites and then has coding experts that make decisions, right? Those decisions might be slightly different, even if they're really the same thing. And so hopefully that helps understand the problem.
I see. So it's not to harmonize the data. It's mostly to understand the differences, right?
We're hoping to use the analysis that we're developing through this tooling to do harmonization later, but that's a separate problem completely from our perspective.
I see. Now, I guess my last real question that after understanding this is that, so let's say if you have different sites modeling their data differently. So let's say, they are using different fields to record something, right? Then isn't that you need to know this field in my data? What I'm trying to say is that, in advance, you should know the possibilities, and then you create a view definition that is like a superset of everything. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And so in practice, that's what we've ended up having to do. And that's exactly one of the problems that SQL on FHIR helps us do. Is it's a lot easier for me to generate FHIR paths and a set of FHIR paths than to write a very complicated JSON query inside of Postgres.
I see. Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
But essentially, they all should comply to US core and all this stuff, like a bunch of IGs. But
they don't.
So with the SQL on FHIR, you can visualize it and maybe make the tool so they quality panel, yes, so they can.
We could provide feedback back to those parties. That's one of the things we're able to do, is provide them feedback about how relatively conformant they are or not. But yeah.
The providers.
I mean, at least there was an Inferno test suite available. So for us, a no Inferno test suite existed for these APIs at the beginning.
But when we started, I remember we started integration, and some EHRs even provide not valid FHIR. So it was response just bundled with something strange inside there.
I see John has his hand up, but maybe we'll do another couple of minutes and then switch over.
Yeah, so there's the payers have these APIs for consumers to get their data. How does that look today? So if I'm a consumer and I have data with multiple of these payers, how can I access it today? Is there kind of like a centralized app, or do they each have their own apps?
So they're separate identity systems. So each payer has implemented a separate smart on FHIR implementation. Then really the payer acts as a kind of pseudo centralizer of FHIR data, in that claims from various providers are submitted to them. So, but in the wild, you could conceivably have multiple payers as an individual, and we publish an endpoint directory now that lists all of the endpoints.
Yeah, so if I had data with two completely different companies today, I'd probably have to log into two different places and look at those things completely separately.
Essentially,
So you're kind of doing
implemented like patient portals, yes, where the patient go and request the data through the API, and this is a different portals. And we participated in some implementation, some of them like doing lazy loading. So unless the member requested FHIR data, they don't even load this data into the patient portal. So.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Josh. And since you mentioned specifically author and publishing, I put you down as an interested party in that work stream. But yeah, this is a great use case. I used to work at OneUp, so this is like near and dear to my heart. And it's really touching upon like these data quality use cases, particularly inter-organizational data quality use cases and baselining analysis that is really just missing, right? Nobody knows. Maybe some people have little views. So really like this use case. Yeah, and please, continue to join and participate. So thank you very much.
And Josh, are you going to share your view definitions? Because
that's what related to that. What I'm hoping to do is,
because there are some like, so for ID, we usually use get resource key, and you can use single quotes. But so share with us, we will give you a bunch of comments.
Well, I'll publish a branch of the Karen BB where I just dump the JSON in there, and that's where I'm hoping to get this to eventually. But yeah, I can share them.
It's good to have a like set of real world examples. Yeah, that's what we discussed in our roadmap.
Yep. All right. Okay, thanks for that. So let me hand it over now to Exciting Development. Has published a couple of his links working on the API. You just, there's a lot to get into. Obviously, we're not going to get into everything this week. I scheduled basically a follow-up on the same topic for next week. So let's just get started. I'll just turn it over to you, and then maybe you walk through it, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. So I just did the brain dump in the Google Doc and shared it. If anybody want like editor access, please contact me. I will provide it. But the rest is provided with the comments access. So yeah, so I just copied SDC role model and apply it to the SQL on FHIR. But I got to some important questions we should answer before. So the first one is, why do we need an API? So, and what kind of use cases we want to cover with this API? So that's my question to the crowd. So guys, what do you think? Because it is not so easy to answer for me. So I can imagine, let's say, if it's like FHIR server, FHIR native, which is with native support of ViewDefinition runner, then things quite clear. But if we start talking about ETLs, pipelines, and all this stuff, do we want to cover this with API, and why? So to build like standard API and build tools, standard tools on top of it to make it like, so we can change one implementation with another, because yeah, so I would love to hear from you guys. Why do we need this API at all?
I think that the roles are kind of useful regardless of whether it's actually an API or not, first of all, like just for describing the requirements of different parts of an implementation. So I think that the server API thing is sort of an optional thing that is applicable and useful for some use cases, because where you're sort of having system to system interactions, maybe across organizational boundaries. You need authentication, all this sort of stuff. Or maybe you've got, like, for example, a user interface like a patient cohort builder. In these sorts of use cases, an API is really useful, right? If you're sort of augmenting bulk export and that sort of architecture where you've got different users sort of passing data around a sort of ecosystem that already have a trust relationship.
Thank you, John. Dan, and then maybe Gina.
Yeah. So I think it's a really good question to ask, Nikolai. So I like it a lot in terms of like, what are we trying to accomplish with an API? And I think two things jumped out at me. The first is, if you just think about these resources being managed by a FHIR server, and maybe it's a FHIR server that just implements view definitions even, but defining where we fit in terms of the FHIR REST API semantics seems valuable. So every resource has to define, the search expressions that are default at the very least, and maybe which operations a server should support on this resource to be kind of a whatever levels we want to have. So I think that one's really high value. And then the other one that jumps out at me is an exporter. And this kind of builds a little bit on some of what we talked about in terms of having view definitions become part of IGs with a set of standard view definitions. And so at that point, you could have a lot of different servers that can implement support for exporting data in those view definition formats. And I think it's really important to have the canonical URL be one of the ways you can export, so that a server may not even implement the whole FHIR server REST API for creating view definitions and manipulating them, but they can say, for this IG, it has this canonical URL for a view definition, and I can export data if you pass in this API call and that particular magic URL. And I think that's like a high value use case too, because it means that like systems that don't necessarily support full stack infrastructure, like an EHR in a lot of cases, not all EHRs, but a lot of EHRs, can implement that piece and just say, for blue button that I have in my EHR, like we support these 5 view definition canonical URLs and can export data in that format. And maybe on the back end, it's all hard coded, but like we don't necessarily care about that. Then it becomes an implementation detail. So like seems super high value. And then kind of next here, I think like nice to have might be some ways to share tooling across systems, but I could also be convinced to like wait on defining that until we have some tooling, and then kind of say, here's the tooling, here's the API needs, and then standardize kind of from implementation for that use case. So I'm curious what other people think about that, but like at least my 2 primary use cases would be supporting export of view definitions that are in IGs and being able to fit nicely in the FHIR REST API world.
Thank you. Gina?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I really like the exporter one. I'm going to push back a little on the FHIR API one, just because already search has a lot of things defined that people don't implement. And so when we start talking about view definitions and expecting servers to instantiate all these tables defined per IG and service those, I worry that it's going to, we might be doing a lot of extra effort for something that's not going to be used in production, because I don't see how EMRs are going to use all those extra database resources to serve different queries to different groups and things like that. And so I'm not convinced on the actual API going back and forth, but I love the exporter version because I think that is, to that point, a great addition to bulk export.
Any other opinions?
Yeah, so we have an initial implementation of this capability, and what we've done is we've made it, we've assumed a view definition is a formal resource. And we sort of like the idea of in export, how you can specify not only the whole system, but also, patients and groups. So we sort of like that idea of being able to do these analyses in an exported way based on those other constructs. And then one area where we might be unique, and I'm not sure if this ends up, where this ends up, but we also have a capability for kicking off these exports with view definitions, either on a scheduled basis, like every Tuesday, some cron tab basis, or in a continuous way. So anything that comes in and out of the FHIR API, we say that's also going to be subject to the view definition rule and end up in a Parquet file. So that's sort of what some of our use cases there.
And like to debate with you, Gina. So I see some analogy with the subscriptions. Yes, with the view definitions, that even if for system it is hard to implement like dynamic loading value view definitions and like serving that for query, yes, they may hard code few of them and expose externally for the querying. And they may like manifest that they have these kind of tables to query through the view definitions and define the structure of these tables. And if it's like FHIR facade that there's a joke, but the guys can describe original tables they have and expose it as a view definitions, like making back mapping.
Yeah, and that's why. And I guess to me, I'm thinking of how widely implemented will it be? Trying to spin up, US core versus AU core versus UK core versus DK core versus all these things. And so a lot of these vendors are saying, yeah, we're stuck in regulatory implementation is, 90% of all of our implementation work right now. And then we have these tiny little spaces for other things. And so when we go to a lot of these vendors and say, oh, we can define the SQL, how you can send a view definition and then people can query using that view definition, I don't think a lot of the major vendors are going to pick it up. And so then we're back to, okay, well, what can we get as a bite of an apple that I think they would implement? And I think the bulk data is, one of the key ones to me to say, oh, if we can say, oh, the Da Vinci guides or whoever guides can go through and make view definitions that Karen, BB, all these different ones to simplify how you describe that output and give an optimized view into it. I think that's a much more likely to get adopted than things like that. When again, I know in search, there's tons of functionality that's defined in search that is not implemented in anywhere except Happy and test servers. So I don't want to.
Yeah, 1 second. I just will tell you that I saw how people implementing facades. Yes, and for them, to be honest, like export data as a FHIR data could be much harder than export like view definition, because view definition is flat and they're living in this flat world. And they can do like direct, like let's say legacy schema to view definition mapping, not through the FHIR, but describe this view and like make it discoverable through the view definition. So that's what I really envision potentially possible. If you look into like epic tables and all this stuff, and if you look at like our view definition samples, so the path from the original tables to view definition is a like smaller than to go to FHIR and go back. So that's my point. And if you have this view definition as a way to express that, I can like maybe even hard code it, like I can give you these 10 tables and you may use it. So it doesn't mean they go through the FHIR. Yes, that means that they're like maybe queryable or like loadable somehow.
Yeah, my concern there is that it's in addition to, because they can't get rid of their FHIR thing. So they're just adding another set of mappings, and then what's the payoff? And so that's where I'm saying, I think what we need, what I personally think is like, hey, let's attack one of these things like the bulk that I think we might be able to get more bites on. And then once there is support for it, then we can talk about, how is it performant? Is it realistic to make it something that can be online? Is it being done on a separate database in the back end anyway? So their front end systems don't even have access to it, and you can't add it to their FHIR query layer. So then we're back to saying it's a huge ask again. I don't know. Again, I'm one opinion. I'm not. I don't want to be.
I agree that like the bulk is a low hanging fruit. So then
yes.
Yeah. I just want to clarify. I guess I was saying like, I think defining kind of the base set of search REST expectations for a server that chooses to implement like resource CRUD for REST CRUD for view definitions is helpful, because then you can kind of say, oh, I know I can search by name and by canonical URL or whatever. So that's what I was suggesting. I think like apply is a fun thing for some servers to implement, but I think in terms of like being broadly implemented initially, like I think people being able to apply arbitrary view definitions is going to be a small subset, hopefully, of implementations, whereas like a bulk export, particularly if we don't even require any of the REST side of it, sorry, or any of the REST API side of it, just to be clear what I'm saying, is not, it's a lift in terms of kind of mapping your flat data into some predefined view definitions, but you don't necessarily have to implement a lot of mechanics in terms of on-the-fly translation. And so I think the more we can facilitate that really easily, but also have some standard kind of guidelines for folks who want to implement a more full-featured server, like I think that seems like a valuable approach. And I like the idea of like in whatever export we do, I think being able to support referencing a REST view definition by reference is useful, and we should support that. But I think even more important is being able to reference a view definition by canonical URL, so that if you have one in an IG and you hard code it into a facade server, people know how to make a query against it without having necessarily to have the full REST API for that view, for the view definition resource. So it like, I think opens up a lot of use cases to have two ways to reference view definitions on export, and servers could choose to only support one or the other or both. But I think, Gino, we're not very far off in terms of kind of making something very easy to implement for facade servers and folks who don't have even potentially a full FHIR API. Like if we want to be really speculative, right, I can imagine a flat database that's not in FHIR format supporting a bulk export that can handle exports that are specifically defined in IGs, so that you could have a server that has no FHIR in it except for being able to export view definitions in a particular format, like if you have a legacy system that's not at all FHIR based. So there's some kind of fun things you can do if you have an API that doesn't require a lot of deep FHIR infrastructure to implement.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think the manager, I put it in chat too, but I definitely think the canonical and CRMI and all those things make sense. And I posted a link because I just saw this week on the app feature framework IG Graham's been editing. There is a logical model that derives from canonical resource. So I know we were struggling with that a while back, and so I thought that was interesting.
Okay, so looks like the bulk export is a low-hanging fruit, and we can target it first. I think like view definition manager is kind of straightforward. It's just a CRUD and search API, and it can be unified with the CRMI. Potentially, I don't know if we have something valuable in CRMI, which is like go beyond the scope of just FHIR, CRUD, history and search, because we don't have a lot of dependencies. Yes, so the CRMI bringing this, like, give me this canonical all dependencies. In our case, not so much. We have, like we discussed, we have a dependency on profile, but I don't know. So not so much dependency, not so complex as like SQL stuff guys are trying to solve with the CRMI. Okay, and then we can refer, at least we can describe how the URL can be resolved. If we have a view definition repository or manager, yes, and you passing URL to the export operation, we may say, so that you can go to repository and look by URL, yes, and the by version. Or you may have it hard-coded. Quite straightforward, probably the view definition validator. It's just one endpoint validate, and it can provide, like, we can describe what kind of validation and checks can be done, and it can be useful for the tooling, yes, and maybe incorporate it into manager, or maybe like standing outside. Yes, and probably the last we can discuss is the view definition runner and the apply by themselves, yes, because it's like. But as I remember, when the Graham joined the group, it was his use case. He said that I want the FHIR servers do support some kind of view definitions and expose it, because the FHIR search is not enough. So, but this is probably like that we can work on. But that's implementation we have enabled. So we can make it optional and like for the future. But I'm really curious about, John, your ideas. So what about API and why do we need it?
Just while I remember it, one of the other things that Graham mentioned in the previous meeting was the use case of being able to ask a server, can you run this view definition? Like sort of slightly different from validation, sort of looking at the view definition and the expressions within it and saying, you know, like, do you actually support this in its entirety? So I'm not sure if that fits within one of these
It
things
could
that
be
we're talking about.
discovery and exporter, just the search API and maybe and read API. Yes, so the server may like expose, like manifest what view definitions are supported for export or for usage.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I pretty much imagined it exactly as you guys are talking about it. Like we work on some sort of variant of bulk export. We, you know, it's basically just a definitional resource for search API purposes and REST CRUD. And there's also like an operation to, you know, execute it perhaps. And validation, we kind of just describe what that means, you know, like as a role over and above regular FHIR validation, if there's anything to say there. And those things can really just live in our IG for now, I think is what we've discussed. And it's just like a guide to integrating this with the FHIR API and sort of like a bit of an extension on the bulk export concept. And that's kind of the first step.
But I still see some, as I said, like it for me, it's similar to subscriptions. So in subscription, you go and you define like topic definitions. Hard coded, they may be dynamic for like native FHIR servers. Then you like manifest that your server do support it, then you can subscribe to it. Yes. So we can do the first step for like, let's say for exporter API. So initially you can like manifest what view definition you support, maybe allow to post the view definition if it's possible. So then you can like run export operation, yes. And later maybe, yeah, the other like point of view, I started thinking about like FHIR analytical server, which is kind of FHIR server plus like view runner capabilities. And then we can like make it like more smart. Like when I'm posting view definition, I'm like initializing the like table of view or export. But I agree that this is probably the last item in this list. So we can start from the easiest one.
The other thing I'm just thinking about is how do these roles map to things that I can see in the capability statement? So how can I tell what the server can do? You know, so there's obviously, you can tell that it supports a certain resource type and that it supports certain search parameters. If there's an operation, you can tell that it supports that. If it supports validation, to what level? Are there sort of multiple different levels of validation that maybe it supports, like sort of shallow versus deep and that sort of thing?
Gina?
Yeah, so having it appear in capability statement is hard because while we can add the endpoint, you can't actually add to REST resource because that is a required binding to the resource types. So it's harder to have it show up there. You could add as an extensions and things, but I would say that it's probably worth doing a lot of this work in that same guide that I linked to the feature definition thing for, but the application feature framework. That's what's grown out of capability statement 2, that it was the thing of people want to say a lot of things that we can't keep adding to capability statements. And so it's a way of defining features in your IG and asking the server if they support them. And then you can even send requests with a header saying, only evaluate this if you support this feature, potentially in this context, potentially with this value. So I would lean towards that just because that's backportable to R4 and later as well. And trying to add these to capability statement might be painful.
And do you have similar situation when you want to like expose logical resources as a FHIR resources?
Yeah, there's nothing that stops you from adding to the API. It's just that you can't advertise in capability statement really, unless you add tons of custom stuff.
I mean,
So,
do you have like real stories when like with your like, how you call it, feature query stuff, when you manifesting that there's a logical resource you can like interact with?
the feature query stuff is still, well, it's in a weird state. It's still, I would consider fairly early. but we're also pushing to get it published alongside R6. So Graham and I, so far, I believe, are the only two people who have played with any of the implementation at all, but we kind of need it. It's in a weird state. So if there are things that we want to add or don't think are there, it's an IG right now, and we have a very low bar for making sure that things work in it, because that's the idea, is that anything that you want to say can work, because it has all kinds of weird tickets open against it, like which versions of the CQL engine can you evaluate with, and how do you distinguish US core versions per smart scope and things like that. Like all those kinds of things are supposed to be expressible in that app feature stuff.
That's still set, so we could not like easily define the CRUD for logical model, yeah? Like in a FHIR way.
Well, I mean, so there's nothing in FHIR that stops you from adding, / view definition to your FHIR server, to your API. You just can't advertise it in a capability statement because there's no resource type.
Mm-hmm.
And you run into the issue that, anyone can propose the resource, and then that will be the resource going forward. Some of that, I'd say, ties into all of the versioning stuff that I don't think we want to open that can of worms here, about how we're going to define resources moving forward, since, once R6 is published and after that, about how all of that works. So hopefully view definition would be a candidate in that same sense to say.
But we have another example. Let's say like topic definition. So you have the same problem. So you could not show for R4, you could not like declare topic definition. Maybe we need some correction in this.
No, so that's the problem. So in R4, what you do is you make a basic resource that is full of cross-version extensions that essentially represent a subscription topic. And I've been working frantically for not quite a year yet, but getting there, on getting all of the cross-version extension definitions right, because they have been terrible. The pattern was wrong and they don't work yet. So I'm trying to fix that. But
this is a real problem. Yes, US will stick to R4. We have a nice subscriptions and like topic based, but nobody can use it like officially, because like you could not use definition.
We have an IG. I went and wrote a whole IG that defines how to use the topic-based subscriptions in R4, R4B, and R5, and all these different things. And it has all those things defined.
How it works?
That's how it works, is by using basic to wrap.
But that's like ugly, yeah.
It is very ugly, and that's why here, let me find, oh gosh, where am I going to find? This was, and you missed the one in September, Nikolai. This was minutes from Atlanta. Oh yeah, that's the one. Can I link directly to these? Yes. Yeah. So I'm happy to share if that's easier, but that's the document that I presented a few times, and this is talking about all of that kind of stuff for moving forward in R6. And so it's saying, here, I've learned from subscriptions, I've been the guinea pig for a lot of these backport and cross version and all these different things, and it doesn't work. I mean, it technically works, but it doesn't.
But technically, if it's not resource but logical model, so theoretically I can backport in a nice way the like topic definition into R4, even R3.
Yep.
Why not use logical model?
Because you can't add it to capability statements. You can't use it from a patient or an observation, or it's not in any compartments. How do you index search parameters? All of these things. And that's why those are all the types of things that we need to discuss and sort out, is saying we need a framework for how we do all of those things. Because subscription topic had the same thing.
Yeah.
Basic wasn't a canonical resource. So we went and added extensions, and this plays with some of the CRMI stuff to say, even though it's a basic, it's kind of a canonical resource, and all this kind of stuff that it's challenging. And so those are the things we're trying to figure out and sort out for hopefully before R6 is published, because once it's published, we're stuck with whatever we agreed to when we published it.
But maybe I don't know, you have an influence on Graham. Maybe do some backdoor, so like an introduce like
that's why that's the thing I linked. That was that thing in September. I started making the hard push saying we need to solve these things, And so
Yeah, because so we okay, we're probably not second, yes, but I don't know. So I can imagine like some new meta frameworks, like I don't know, clinical decision support API or something like this. When the people want to backport the bunch of API to R4, even R3, and they will bring some canonical or non-canonical resources. They want to advertise it, and they want to have a CRUD system on top of it.
yeah, and that's why going to R4 is going to be very challenging, just because those types of things are set. If you said we can have a reference to, you know, an encounter and observation, no one in R4 is going to understand if you put a reference to anything else. And so that's where we say, okay, well, we need to figure out how we define all those things moving forward so that we can still have some sort of structural integrity. And yet,
Maybe some official extension to extend capability statement that way.
it has to be in every time you have a reference. So it needs to be something that
But
you
usually
can
such type of resources, you don't reference them a lot, yes? So you don't reference like topic definition too much from your patient or something else. So this is
well,
like,
you need to reference it from subscription. And you need to, like, it's not that you need it all over the place. Generally, you need it somewhere. There's very few resources that are completely in a bubble. And there are ones that need to, and there are new resources that are being defined that are specifically not. You know, when we talk about some of the level 0, you know, new proposed resources for R6, they're new resources.
that brings us that like references, resource type list or like profiles should be open and extensible, yes, like value sets.
But that's why that has trade-offs, because then you start saying, yeah, I put in an organization instead of a patient, and what does that mean? Or I put in a group instead of a patient, what does that mean? And if no one can understand your data, are we in a better space that I could say it and no one could understand it? Or, and that's why we spent many hours talking about a lot of that. I'm happy to go through it as much more, but yeah, it's an open thing. And so I am very much interested in saying, what do we think this can look like in the different versions of FHIR, so that we can use that as part of that discussion to say, okay, here's a good example. This is essentially a resource, not actually defined as a resource yet, but maybe we want it to be, maybe we don't. Maybe we're not quite at the point where we would want it yet, so we would want it in R7 or something like that. So how do we get it in use and start getting that feedback and all those other things while not locking down, oh, here's the definition and we're stuck with it.
But yes, another idea, I don't know. So for, let's say I have a FHIR server, yes, and it's on R4 for data, but I can tell that you can use like subscription topics, but they are R6 or R5. And you have one FHIR server which like serve different versions, but you can create like R6 topic subscription, yes, and use it for resources.
Yes, and it works partially. Some of the similar problems. When you have a bundle, you can't change versions within a bundle. And so then you start talking about things like how do you search and how do you go across includes and how do you do some of those types of things, because you can't.
And they're usually in bubbles. So let's say that I'm serving subscription resource and topic definition only from R5. So, and when you define it, you're working on R5 API, and when you're working with the data, you are on R4.
Yeah, but it's the similar type of thing. If you said a ViewDefinition has, you know, accesses resources that cross R4 and R5, how do you link between them? Do you mean the R4 version of patients or the R5 version of patients?
Okay, so welcome to the version hell.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think this is a great discussion. I don't want to use all of the analytics on FireStream for it, because we can have a whole session dedicated to this. I'm happy to.
But we will, because okay, so for now I only see like we can only like without contradicting with FHIR define like export API using some magic URL which somehow we get. And maybe this is a reason for us to still introduce ViewDefinition into R6 as a resource.
Yeah, and I think it would be, you know, I definitely would think it's worth considering saying we should propose ViewDefinition as an R6 resource, and then that becomes part of that discussion of saying, well, how do we reference it in earlier versions? How do we make changes to it moving forward without breaking R6? You know, that's what a lot of these discussions are all about.
Because as I know, like most of implementers, including us and Smile, they just give up and okay, so you have R6 subscription topics or R5 with your R4 data. It just works. Go and work. We just break like FHIR stuff, but because like most of users are expecting that, so they say, okay, where's my topic subscriptions on R4? Here's it.
Yeah, and there's kind of these two. Sorry, I'll stop.
No. I'm just time check here. We're over time. I mean, obviously, you guys can continue if you want. I will have to go, but just taking a pin in this and talking about next steps. Nikolai, based on our conversation, do we think we have enough material to at least take more of a pass at the document? Okay, and then what we can do, I think, is just restart the conversation, or at least next steps based on maybe we talk about it on Zulip next week, and then I'll keep continuing the same conversation next week, next Tuesday. Does that work for everybody? Okay, great. Alrighty. All right. So good discussion. Yeah. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one.
Yeah.
See you.
Yeah, Nikolai, if you want to keep talking, I don't know what you're doing next.
Yeah, we can say so.
I can keep the recording. I mean, I can keep it on for you guys.
Oh, either way, I don't know if it needs to be recorded. It's
I might stop the recording just for
Yeah.